Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's meeting, the Contour community meeting. So happy to have you all here. Today is April 28th or April 29th, depending on where you're joining from. First of all, we got a few things that we want to talk about, things that we've been working on here. And I'll share my screen and then I'll let the team talk. So the first thing, of course, is the new release. I put up the blog post here. I'm going to share that in the chat too, so you all can see it. We just sent that out. Here's the HackMD first, and then here's the blog post with the major new enhancements here. Steve, do you want to talk about these enhancements?
Yeah, I can do that. So cool. Yeah. So Contour 1.4 is out. So the big things we have are we have this client authentication now. So you can specify a client certificate. So when your client goes to make a request, Contour or vicariously Envoy will validate that that's a valid thing you can do to make a request back to that vhost. So this one was driven a lot by the community. So thank you, Fatero, for a lot of your work and help on that. And driving this forward was, I know, one of those things that seems easy on paper, but the implementation can get tricky. But yeah, so there in the virtual host of a proxy, you can see there's this client validation struct now. And basically you just pass it the cert that you want to reference, and then it'll set it all up from there, which is cool. So this is only doing cert authentication. The next one, so I'm happy to see that James joined for whatever time it is for him. So we're going to talk about Auth, I think, next. So adding different authentication mechanisms for Envoy. But this is pretty cool. So this is neat if you need to have this client auth kind of functionality for Contour. So that's that one. If we just go down a little bit, Jonas, there's some more things with ingress that we changed. So there's some things with the ingress class that we updated. So before, if you annotated an object, with an ingress class, what would happen was Contour would match that ingress class. So it looked in the cluster, and if an object matched the class that you specified, Contour would process it like it should. But what I think other ingress controllers do the same thing is it also process any record that did not have a class defined. And this is a problem if you had multiple controllers in your cluster. So each controller would then try to process the same record. And this actually came up with the user in Slack where they were trying to do an upgrade from one version of Contour to another. So we thought, hey, why don't we just set ingress classes on them and then let the old version have a class and the new version have a different class. But if you don't specify every object, then it would process every object, I guess. So now in 1.4, if you specify a class on Contour, Contour will only process that class. So it will only look for things in that class. So if there's no annotation or it doesn't match, then Contour won't look for it. And that, again, there's a note there. It says it applies both to ingress as well as the proxy objects. So that's kind of cool. If that's clear. So it's kind of different. I think Nginx will still process the old way. I looked at their docs and there was a big red box saying it'll still process any that doesn't have anything. So the other thing that we're doing with ingress is the status. So there are an update now. So Contour has never set the status of an ingress object. So if you expose it with, say, a type load balancer or something, which is over the last 2 years Contour has existed, we haven't ever set that status. So now Contour will actually set the status properly from the service type that Envoy uses. So Contour will look at the Envoy service. It'll introspect that the address on that resource, and then it'll set that status on the ingress object. You can also specify a flag to Contour, which is that ingress status flag. And what that will do is let you specify the ingress that should be placed onto that resource, right? So maybe you're in AWS and you have some sort of crazy ELB name, which you don't want to put on your objects. You can override that with the object that you'd like to see, or the DNS name you'd like to see. So that's helpful. That also opens up the idea of using the external DNS work now. So if you wanted to have it do some things automatically, now that that status is getting set, that integration should work now for you. And I believe we only did that for ingress objects. I think we're looking to add that to the proxy objects as well, having the same status block. So then you can also apply external DNS to proxy or something. So that's the ingress stuff. I think there was one more thing. Maybe not. Oh, the one thing we talked about was this in 1.3, we had a flag to say use the v1 beta 1 ingress flag. So Kubernetes had ingress was in the what was the namespace? I'm blanking now on it. It's now in networking.k8s.io. Extensions, I think, was an extensions group, and they removed that. So now the object lives in the networking.k8s.io group in Kubernetes. So we had a flag to let us process the old version as well as the new version. In 1.3, that got removed because now we're far enough ahead where that flag shouldn't matter as much. So I guess we called this out was because if you had that flag still referenced on a new version of Contour wouldn't start up. It would fail because that flag doesn't exist. So just another call out to make sure that folks are aware of that change. So that's it. I think that was the big things for 1.4. There's a handful of other things in there on the release notes on the GitHub page of all the different things we fixed and looked at. So I think it's another fun release.
Awesome.
Anyone have any questions on any of that kind of stuff or anything that we talked about in 1.4?
I just want to do a shout out here to the contributors that Nick added here as well. You already did a shout out to Taro. I just want to make sure that we do a shout out to Peter Grant as well. So awesome job. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know Peter added a few things there's now a status or a version in Contour that gets written, and that's on the command line as well as exposed through Prometheus metrics. So you can get to the version that Contour is running through that, which is good. So you don't have to grep for the image name in your deployments anymore. So that's helpful.
Yeah, Michael here from JPM. So we're looking forward to that. We're going to embed that into our dashboards, and the ingress class stuff is also a huge win for us. So thank you for both of those things.
Awesome.
Nice. Any other questions, comments for 1.4?
Cool. Thanks for the update, Steve. This was indeed a pretty big release for us and had significant contributions from a lot of folks. So that was awesome. It looks like this time is working fairly well. We're seeing more and more folks joining our Contour community meetings. So, very glad to see more folks involved in Contour. That's awesome.
Yeah, welcome everyone. Let's see here. The next topic that we had on the status updates here is external auth. I don't know if James wanted to cover that.
Yeah, I can talk about that.
And James, if you don't mind, let me put a little bit of a preface to that. So we want to make a few big bets for Contour moving forward. And these are items that basically are going to improve Contour at large scale enterprise deployments, as well as allow Contour to better interoperate with some of the needs of our users and customers. Some of those big bets are basically going to be things that both have been requested by the community and things that we also think that are strategic moving forward. Authentication, and that's the one that James is going to talk about, is one of those large bets. Other items in that same bucket of prioritization include rate limiting and our ability to basically provide a key piece of functionality that others have asked for, as well as things like supporting to the access log service and items like that. Also, another big ticket item that we're looking moving forward is this ability to almost operate Contour in a self-service capability. And we're going to deep dive on that in a future community meeting. So stay tuned for that. So the reason why I'm saying that is every release is going to include a whole lot of small fixes that kind of address pressing issues, but we also want to start making some big bets on items that are really important to us in making Contour better and better suited for your scenarios. James, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael. So external auth has been, I guess people have been asking around for it for quite a long time. This PR 2459, this issue 2459, first, before we even get to a design, I wanted to capture a bunch of information about, you know, what we think a design would do. So, you know, auth is a big topic. I want to get some consensus around what we mean by auth, what people even want Contour to do. So first we have some goals and non-goals. So these are things that I've extracted from talking to people and from the issues and by comparing the feature sets of other ingress controllers and API gateways, which, you know, people could use instead or in conjunction with Contour. So I think we need to support multiple. This is primarily, oriented around external authentication servers, which is one of our goals later on. So I think we need to support multiple external authentication servers. So Contour sort of has a model of soft multi-tenancy. We assume that there's multiple teams in the same cluster with you know, different applications, and as soon as we make that assumption, you know, it follows that a different application might have a different authentication type or mechanism. So we probably need some way for different virtual hosts or different applications in a cluster to specify that they have a different kind of authentication. Number two, the second goal is the same as the first. So we have different authentication types, right? So someone wants, one application wants basic auth, another one wants OIDC, another one wants some sort of API key. This one, I would say number three, external name authentication servers, is kind of a stretch goal. That might be something that we don't deliver in an initial release. We might add it later. My thinking there is that when you're running an auth server, you don't necessarily always want to run an instance of it in the same cluster that you're running, that you're providing ingress through Contour. So you might have a separate cluster where you have your authentication service because it has, you know, particular operational needs or something. So you want to point your application cluster to an authentication service that's outside the cluster. We want to interoperate with existing authentication servers. You know, external authentication is a thing in the ingress world and the API gateway world today. We want to provide access to those services from Contour. We don't want to invent our own protocols. We don't want to. I don't think we should. I don't think we should expect people to write authentication servers specifically for Contour. You should be able to use the ones that you already have. Because we're in the Envoy world, Envoy has an external auth protocol for gRPC and authentication and HTTP. So if we say we're not going to invent our own server attachment protocol, then clearly it probably follows that we'll use the Envoy one, in which case the existing servers out there support both gRPC and HTTP wire protocols. So we should expose the ability to have both or either of those in the Contour API. We always want to talk, number six, we always want to talk to authentication servers over TLS. Number seven, it's sort of a general principle. If we have additional configuration, I suspect we will, then we want to then that API service needs to look and feel similar to HTTP proxy. So we don't want to invent some completely new way of referencing services, for example. Maybe we should try and reuse the service concept and API service from HTTP proxy in this new context. The final, I think, goal or requirement is that applications do need to disable auth on specific paths. So if you have an application which which is authenticated, then there's almost certainly some specific paths on it which aren't going to be authenticated. You might need to serve some specific assets or a login page or some other specific pages for which you need to turn off Auth. So it's not just, so I don't think it's sufficient for us to say, you can't just, for us to say this application is authenticated. You need to be able to say this application is authenticated except for this small number of routes.
That's interesting. How do other competitors do that? For example, have I looked at into how other folks do this disable auth for specific paths? Because one way to achieve it is to have microservices infrastructure where there's a specific microservice that's serving the non-auth paths, right? That's one way of doing it, but it doesn't work for every case.
Yeah. So what you can do, so one way to do, I mean, if you're in a microservices architecture, I guess there's two ways you could do that, or at least two ways. One way is to say you have different host names. So Contour would view that as different applications, different proxies, different proxy objects, and you could say one proxy object is authed and one isn't. Another way to do is to say that, well, it's the same application, the same virtual host name, but you have paths within that. So because people bring their existing applications to Contour, then we kind of want to support both of those use cases, I think.
So this is Venki from UDP. I have worked on Kong before, and we have done similar to this. So what the way they implement is in Kong, you can have a multiple path, and then each path is attached to a plugin. So you can create a plugin, authentication plugin, and then attach to each path. So if you do not have an authentication plugin for a specific path, your authentication won't kick on. It will be like a unprotected.
Right, I think that makes sense. Most of the API gateways I've seen have some sort of mechanism that's more specific than a virtual host name.
So that's basically sorry, your beginning of talking came in delayed to me, my bad. So it's basically, Venki, that's an opt-in model, right? And I think James is talking about an opt-out model, as in like everything's authenticated except what you opt out. Am I reading that right?
Is that question to me or to Venki?
No, this is no. It's I mean, there's no opt-in or opt-out or exception-based model in there. In that model is you if you want to include everything, you just put a slash and then add a regular expressions in the path itself. You can do that way too. So whatever the regular expression catches, the authentication will kick in for those paths.
Got it. Thank you.
It's interesting to maybe mix auth models if that's a use case for folks. Like maybe these paths use OIDC, but these use basic auth. I know that's getting crazier. But
I was waiting for someone to ask for that.
No. I guess that's in my head. That's what I was thinking when you're saying, hey, there's like these different auth kind of like configurations. You attach this auth to these paths and this type of auth to these paths. So maybe one application uses some custom auth for their application, but somebody else uses a different one. Maybe they're not all shared. Just to think about.
Yeah, that's actually tricky. I think logically that makes sense. I think the implementation of that is tricky. There's a section further down where I discuss how Envoy represents Auth-Z, external Auth-Z, and we'll see why that we'll see why implementing that particular semantic is going to be tricky. Sorry, James, can you scroll back up for a second to the non-goals? Let's cover that quickly. So non-goals, I don't want to do. I want to draw a couple of lines in the sand. We shouldn't do external auth in Contour itself. We want to focus on external auth servers. That's more general, I think. And let's just focus on the general case rather than diverting resources into specialized cases. We're not going to do insecure auth server attachments. We will always want to configure external auth servers over HTTPS. And at least for V1, we don't want to support this in ingress and ingress route. I think we would never do it in ingress route. It's deprecated. No one should be using it. Ingress is kind of less clear. Just for scoping, I don't want to do it in the first version. But it is a supported API and it will continue to be supported. So if people need it, then I think we should look at doing it, at adding, bringing that back, bringing the feature back to ingress over time. Okay, so I think the next probably important thing is if we look at Envoy, if you scroll down, Jonas, to Envoy or Auth Z semantics. Pretty much the mechanism by which you add an external auth server is using the Auth Z filter in Envoy, and it has some kind of interesting semantics which aren't always ideal to expose as an API. Basically, the Auth Z is a HTTP filter. You specify it as a field on the connection manager. And the connection manager, behind the connection manager object, you can have one virtual host or many virtual hosts. It depends on how you configure Envoy. What Contour does since 1.4 is for HTTP on port 80, Contour configures a single connection manager where all the clear text virtual hosts are attached. So the corollary of that is that everything on that one HTTP connection manager gets the same Auth Z server, right? So that means that the only way you can configure, the only way you can build an Envoy configuration on port 80 is every virtual host has the same Auth server, same Auth mechanism. And that conflicts with our goals that we talked about earlier. But since 1.4 on TLS, Contour constructs a configuration tree with an extra filter chain match on the TLS SNI name, because we started to strongly bind SNI names to virtual hosts, to virtual host routes. So we actually have a HTTP connection manager per root proxy, so per FQDN in the TLS world. So that lets each Contour application, each HTTP root proxy, have its own Auth Z server in the TLS world. So that's great. So that kind of gets back in the TLS world. That gets us back to the behavior that we want in our goals. So we end up, there's kind of three possibilities of what we could build using the Auth Z plugin. We could have all HTTP virtual hosts have to have the same server, and we can build each HTTPS virtual host can have a separate one. But there's a wrinkle, I think, with the work Steve's doing on fallback certificates, right? Because once we support a fallback TLS certificate, then that's going to bring you back to the configuration where you have multiple virtual hosts behind the same HTTP connection manager for hosts which share access to a fallback certificate. In that case, you're back to having the same Auth Z server. So it's probable that what we would have to do is say you can have Auth Z just for that second case. That's the simplest one to kind of explain. There's kind of other ways to slice this, which I'm looking for feedback for, mainly from the team in resources, in around resources. It's possible to kind of raise these limitations, and I guess that speaks to the complexity of the implementation and the time it's going to take to build this thing out. So we could, in theory, put a intermediate Auth Z server, which we would configure out of band with additional information from our API that kind of removes these limitations. So the approach here would be you have like a 2-hop of external service. So the first hop is everything goes to, and then that one has some out-of-band configuration which knows how to apply Auth at a finer granularity than the default Envoy X-Auth Z filter. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to assume it does.
Yes.
And so,
yeah, I didn't know if we wanted to. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so that filter would then, you'd have some out-of-band policy to say, oh, okay, so you can configure it at a path granularity, for example. And so that's the mechanism. So Steve talked earlier about you know, a use case where you'd have different auth servers or different mechanisms for paths within an application, and this is a mechanism by which you could implement that. So with this issue, what I'd really like is for people to, particularly in the community, people who have a need for this thing or existing use cases, to just comment on it and give us some feedback about whether the goals meet their needs, what their needs are if we haven't captured it already, whether this approach is going to work for them, or whether they have use cases where it's going to fail.
Yeah, I think focusing on the use cases of what you want to do with it versus how we can make it Envoy do what we want it to do are two different things. You know, I think that the technical side of it, we can help figure that out, but more of like your use case to actually consume these things, and then we'll work out the details.
Yeah,
of how to make that happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I'm not gonna get caught in the weeds of how Envoy works and stuff. You know, like obviously there are some limitations of it, but more so if we can capture your high level concepts and then we can apply that into Contour, that would be helpful.
Cool. So I think the rest of that people can read at their leisure if they're interested. And
I have a quick question on goal number three of you. So go up a little bit, and
yep.
Yeah. So yeah, goal number 2, support multiple type. So I don't see a SAML type in there. Are you planning to do SAML?
What we would do, I think yes, we would want to support SAML. I don't think we would ship a SAML binding as part of the Contour project necessarily. What I would like to do is take advantage of any existing external auth SAML servers.
Mm-hmm.
Have a listing. I'm not sure if there is one out of the box that I know of that speaks SAML. I don't have one listed that speaks SAML natively, but yeah, SAML I think should be a supported. SAML should be a supported mechanism. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey folks, we're out of time. James, thank you for the discussion and the insight into the external auth. Like James mentioned, everyone, if you're interested in this, please go and add your scenarios, add your comments and feedback there. Once you design and start executing, it's always harder or a lot more costly to go change things. So putting feedback early is exactly what we're looking for. All right, well, everybody have a great rest of your day or week, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks at this time. If you're interested in joining us at the later time, that's more Asia friendly, we have Contour community meetings every week. So see you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Have a good one. Bye.